Today, I would like to talk to you about rigorous solutions to inverse problems in computational modeling. I want us to cover the concept of inverse problems from uncertainties, difficulties, to some strategies to try and improve the way we solve the inverse problems so we get better generalized models out. My name is Daniel N. Wilk from the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and joining us in this conversation is Patrick Petit from IMT North Europe in France. So first off, what does it take to model? How difficult is it, and what do we need? Well, first off, to be able to do modeling, we need some computational model, usually some geometry, and then some model parameters. Once we have all three of those, we can start churning out solutions and results and responses. The question is really not what does it take to model, but what does it take to have a useful model? And now things become a bit more tricky because we have to make sure we have a computational model that is efficient, accurate enough, complete enough, detailed enough. We need to make sure that all geometries that we are modeling are sufficiently modeled. And that can be from geometries that we interact with down to even geometry of parameters in the model itself, like in discrete element modeling, the particle shape. And then we need to make sure that the model parameters are correct and sufficiently correct that they are useful for our purposes. So in essence, inverse problems just look at that third point to try and make sure that we have sufficient model parameters. That's all. That really focuses on that pinpoint and say, how do we get that and identify that? So an inverse problem is essentially a strategy to try and find the correct model parameters from experimental data when we don't have explicit knowledge about the parameters, prior knowledge about the parameters. So we don't know upfront what they are, but we need to figure out what they are. That is in essence what the inverse problem focuses on. So why is it important that we solve these problems? Well, for one, all problems are wrong. And as we've seen, we need to try and make them useful. And solving the inverse problem properly is part of that usefulness. And to make this point clear, I would like you to think of a computational model as the class of physics that we solve, and the model parameters as the specific physics for a problem or the specific details for a problem. So that's what I would like you to think of. So in essence, if either our physics that we solve is wrong or the specific problem that we solve is wrong, we will make poor predictions. In addition, if the physics that we solve is wrong or the specifics of the problem is wrong, we can even draw wrong conclusions. And that's really the danger of solving an inverse problem poorly, is when we have often maybe the correct physics, but the wrong model parameters. And that's usually then when the wheels come off, when we start making predictions and claims that are maybe not 100%. So what is so difficult about inverse problems? Why are these problems so challenging to solve? What makes them challenging? Well, first off, because they are unsupervised learning problems. So they require that we accurately determine unknown model parameters, the correct model parameters, when only have available experimental responses and a model. And in addition, these experimental responses are often riddled with uncertainties, aleatoric uncertainties, etc., that we look into. And it might even be that not all parameters are even obtainable, so that there might be multiple solutions depending on the strategy that we follow. All of these things are now complications that we need to deal with. But the fact is, our data set is unsupervised because we have measured experimental responses, a model, but we have no idea what the model parameters should be. So there are no labels associated with the model parameters for a given experimental data set. So let's unpack these four in a bit more detail. First off, unsupervised data sets cast us immediately in this world of unsupervised learning. So we have to solve an unsupervised learning problem. Because we're using models, there are epistemic uncertainties as we only approximate the actual reality with a model. We never sufficiently detailed enough or correct enough that we really have a perfect fit. So there's always some model error, which is essentially the epistemic uncertainties. And then because we do measurements, there are noise, environmental operating conditions, environmental changes, etc., that causes noise in the measured signal, which is essentially then electronic uncertainties. They don't contribute towards the experiments and the parameters we're trying to infer, but they do contribute towards adding noise to the system and making it a bit more complicated. And then lastly, not all parameters are identifiable. I myself am not a fan of this idea of an ill-posed and a well-posed problem. I don't think that exists, and I don't think it's the wrong word, the right words to use. But I'm putting it in here because that's the classical, typical terminology that's used when it comes to inverse problems. For me, it's a grayscale from well-posed to ill-posed. It depends on the variance, essentially, of the accuracy with which we can determine a parameter. And it's not whether the problem is ill-posed or well-posed, it's which parameters we can actually infer and which ones we can't. That is important. Okay, so to give you an idea of what I mean with an ill-posed problem, in quotes, is imagine my model is just addition. It's a very simple computational model. It just adds. And if my input parameters to my model are two numbers, then essentially the output of my model is just the sum of the two numbers. So if I now do an experimental observation of the output of my model, and I say the output that I observed was 10, can you tell me the two numbers that I added? And the reality is you can't. There are an infinite number of options available. And so you can't tell me the exact correct model parameters, but you can give me sort of a set of infinite number of them. And that's really what we mean with ill-posed. And there are many combinations or many solutions to the same answer. Okay, so the aim of the game is finding the correct model parameters, 100%. So there are really two goals that we need to try and achieve. First off is which parameters can we actually identify or can be inferred. That's called our parameter observability problem. And secondly, how accurately can we infer the ones that we can infer, and that's parameter identifiability. So those are the two overarching problems in inverse analysis that we need to try and tackle. Is which parameters do we even stand a chance of identifying, and then how accurately can we actually identify them? And that's really what we need to be able to tackle. If you look at current approaches, the predominant approach used today is, unfortunately, just find a set of parameters that reconstruct the response and then either assume or claim that these parameters are correct. That's essentially the predominant strategy that I see in the various domains that I've done research in. And it's a problem that started when I started my PhD studies, a problem that I sort of solved without actually realizing that a lot of people were doing it maybe in a different way. But I'll talk to that in a short while. So in essence, if you do this then with enough conviction, this claiming that the parameters are correct, you can even get your paper published. As a matter of fact, literature is riddled with examples of review papers and inverse papers that did exactly just that. Just find a set of parameters and then move on and pretend it's correct. But it's not sufficient. We have now enough understanding on conceptual understanding to understand that there might be multiple parameters. And if you don't find the correct ones, we actually haven't solved anything. So the question is, how do we solve this problem? What is the primary strategy to solve an unsupervised learning problem? Simple. We try and convert it into a supervised learning problem. The question is, how do we do this for an inverse problem? How can we convert this unsupervised problem into a supervised learning problem? And the answer is also simple. It lies in the model. So we can exploit the model to help us turn this unsupervised problem into a supervised learning problem. And how do we do that? Well, simply. We can use our model, guess a set of input parameters or model parameters, use the model then to simulate the response, and now we can pretend that the response was experimentally measured and see what parameters do we recover when we do the inverse problem. And now we can compare it actually against the parameters that we chose, the parameters that are known. And now we can start to quantify properly. So essentially, we're just using the model to create a data set that's purely simulated. The input parameters are simulated or chosen. The simulation simulates the output response, and we just pretend that that is essentially the response from the inverse, from the experimental data. We can even use the actual experimental data to identify aleatoric uncertainties and add that then to our simulated response so that it looks more realistic. We can even add some epistemic uncertainties and use our model with a slight variation on an underlying physics model, and then we try to infer it for a different physics model that's related but not quite the same. And now we can mimic epistemic uncertainties in that way. So in essence, we can really make the supervised problem quite mature, and we can add a lot of detail in that's typically not available from a purely simulated response. And now we can go and quantify the accuracy of each individual model parameter given a specified set of observed or response data. And that is how simple it is to solve this problem. It's called the virtual inverse problem. I've been doing it since 2005, sort of intuitively, the way I solved the problem in my own PhD when I was doing a material characterization problem. Before I looked at the actual experimental data that I was given to my supervisors at the time, I first tried to solve the problem virtually to try and understand what can I see and what can't I see. That was the first time I really got involved in inverse problems. And as I got into different fields and aspects of modeling, I realized that this approach was definitely not the norm, but it was sort of the exception. That most people really just got a set of parameters that reproduced the experimental response accurately and then claimed that that's the correct parameters. So since the first paper that got published in the end was 2010 on this, because the gradient-only optimization was a bit controversial, so that delayed publication for some time. But essentially, we used it for estimating boundary conditions and material parameters. We've used it for comparing direct versus direct mapping versus iterative inverse problems. Looked at sensor placement, effect on observability based on the sensor placement, to try to find the best place to put your sensors so that you have the best chance for identifiability of parameters in your model. And then even in discrete element modeling, where we really just tackle that for from bulk experiments, quantify what parameters can be identified from which bulk experiments, etc. So that's essentially an evolution over the last 15 years of how I've used inverse problems. And this only captures a snapshot of that. So the importance in additive manufacturing is the following. Before we can really start doing fancy and complex additive manufacturing modeling, we first have to really make sure that we have models that are reliable and accurate, and then make sure that we have an approach to identify the parameters reliably and to identify what experimental data is required so that all the parameters can be identified, because without that, we are really toying on the verge of useless instead of useful models. And that is part of the complexity of this additive manufacturing space. The models are complex, the parameter sets are large, and just first of understanding really in detail what kind of level of experimental data is required and what experimental tests we can conduct is really an important aspect. And as I use virtual inverse problems to identify, given an experimental data set, what parameters I can identify, I can actually use the virtual inverse problem to sample a couple of experimental tests or setups that would give me data, and using my models, I can then model those and then identify which ones are useful for which parameters and which ones are sufficient then to have a shot at least at identifying the parameters with sufficient accuracy for the problem at hand. And this sort of concludes the talk. I hope to hear from you. So pop me an email or leave a comment in the channel.